Okay, in this second session here, we are going to talk about the different types of cells that we find in bone tissue. The first type of cell we're going to talk about is an osteocyte. Osteocytes are mature bone cells, and what you will see is we'll have that complementary site blast setup that we've talked about in the before, where the sites are the mature bone cells and the blasts are the baby bone cells. This is the most abundant type of cell in our bone tissue, and their job is to recycle calcium and assist in the repair of bone tissue itself. The second type of cell that we have in bone tissue are the osteoclasts. These are found in the endosteum, which is that inner lining of your bone. These are kind of some freakish looking cells. They're very large and they have over 50 nuclei in them, so not a very typical cell at all. What they do is they actually secrete both acid and enzymes to break down bone from the inside, and you'll see why that's important when we start talking about growth. This helps to regulate calcium and phosphate level in our body fluids, so if we need to store calcium, they won't secrete as much acid or enzymes. If we need more calcium or phosphate in our body fluids, they'll actually break down bone more quickly to help keep those levels up. What they are doing when they are doing this is they are actually removing the bony matrix around the cells themselves. The last type is an osteoblast, and again, this is a baby bone cell. These are found in the endosteum, and their job is to produce new bone. So what they are doing is they are adding to the bony matrix because they are actually maturing as they develop into osteocytes. Now, in terms of bone growth, how they actually grow, it involves these three cells. We have two main mechanisms of bone growth. The first is called ossification. Ossification is the process of replacing other tissues like cartilage with bone. Now, the other type of growth that we'll talk about is appositional growth. And this is when the diameter of the bone, like the shaft of the bone, gets bigger while the ossification part actually makes it grow longer. So we're going to first focus on ossification. The first type of ossification we have is intramembranous ossification. Basically here, bone develops in sheets or membranes of connective tissue, like in our skull, our jaw, and our collarbone. The other type of ossification that we'll talk about is endochondral ossification, and this is where we actually replace hyaline cartilage with bone tissue, and this is very typical in our long bones. Now, with endochondral ossification, there's 5 different steps. In the first step, the chondrocytes enlarge and the surrounding matrix starts to calcify. And then the chondrocyte actually dies. It gets cut off from its nutrient supply. The osteoblasts on the surface of the shaft, now remember, we've got this whole container of cartilage, so the ones on the very outer surface form a very thin bone layer. And as that is forming, the blood vessels actually start to penetrate through the perichondrium. They have to penetrate early, otherwise they won't be able to make it through into the inner layers of the bone. The blood vessels then continue to invade the inner portion of the cartilage, and then new osteoblasts start producing spongy bone towards the center of the bone and starts moving outwards towards the ends. The osteoclasts then break down some of the spongy bone that's in the middle of the bone to form the marrow cavity. Then the cartilage starts to ossify just at the top end of the cavity, just above the bone. And this starts to form what we call an epiphyseal plate. Now, what happens is basically we end up with like a sandwich where we have bone underneath, a layer of cartilage, and bone on the top. All right. This epiphyseal plate continues to enlarge and causes the bone to grow larger or longer. Now, in the epiphyses, the centers start to calcify and fill with spongy bone. So we end up, in the end, with two areas of bone separated by an epiphyseal plate, and a thin cap of cartilage remains for the joint. So this is what you kind of see. Here, we've got the chondrocytes enlarging. They start to die. Okay, we get this thin layer of bone in the diaphysis with the blood vessels penetrating. We also get the formation of that marrow cavity as the osteoclasts wear it away, and the bone starts to grow longer this way. Then we get this layer of cartilage here, okay, that starts to form. That's the epiphyseal plate, and we get the widening of that marrow cavity. And then you can see here in step 5, we get the center area starting to calcify. So we have the epiphyseal cartilage, we have a layer of bone underneath, and then we have some more bone on top. Now, eventually, bones can't grow longer forever. So what happens is that epiphyseal plate moves outward. Eventually, the osteoblasts overrun the growing end of the cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. And this happens due to the production of sex hormones during puberty. The end of epiphyseal growth is called epiphyseal closure, but you can still kind of see where that epiphyseal plate once was on an X-ray. It forms just like a line on the X-ray. Now, in terms of when this happens, the timing does vary based on the bones involved and the particular person, just because we're all kind of different from each other. Now, the second type of growth that we have is appositional growth. And appositional growth is where the cells of the periosteum develop into osteoblasts and then produce a bony matrix. So what happens is we get new bone laid down on the outside of the shaft of the bone, and then the osteoclasts erode the inner surface to enlarge the marrow cavity. And you can actually see that here on the diagram. Okay, we get new bone laid out on the outside, and then the old bone is eaten away by the osteoblasts, and that continues. So what we end up with as an adult is a bone that is much larger in diameter, but really not all that much thicker in terms of true bone thickness. Now, in order for this bone growth to occur, we need a couple of different minerals and nutrients available in a pretty good supply as we're creating this bone. So specifically, we need a reliable source of minerals, specifically calcium salts. We need vitamin D3, vitamin A, vitamin C, and hormones. So if one of these things are missing, we can have some problems. One of the problems we can have is rickets, and rickets are either soft or bending bones that occur in growing children. This is due to a vitamin D3 deficiency. Rickets used to be kind of not a problem, but now, with video games and everybody staying inside, rickets is kind of becoming more of a problem. What happens is as the children start growing and they start walking, their bones actually aren't hard enough to support their weight. So like their femurs end up with this curve in it, and they end up bow-legged sometimes. Scurvy is a disease that creates weak and brittle bones, and it's was actually very common in like the time of Columbus, where you had very long sailing trips where you didn't have a good supply of fresh fruits and vegetables, specifically ones that didn't have vitamin C in them. So not only would it make them do other things, but it would also affect their skeleton as well. Now, bone maintenance is, once growth ends, bone maintenance occurs. This is a balanced process of bone formation and bone destruction. So we're destroying bone and forming bone at the same rate. So we end up with no net growth. This process is called remodeling. And if you think about like when you remodel in a house, you get rid of the old stuff and you put in new stuff. And that's exactly what the bone is doing. What this does is it allows the bone to adapt to new stresses that may be occurring or lack of stress. So if you start a new workout, you're putting new stress on the bone, it's important that your bones go through the proper maintenance to adapt to those stresses. Now, sometimes, though, we're not able to adapt to the stresses, and we end up with a fracture. A fracture is a cracking or breaking of the bone. There are two types of fractures. We have a closed or simple fracture, where the broken bone actually stays inside of the skin, and an open or compound fracture, where the bone actually projects through the skin. With a closed fracture, we usually have a blunt end to the break of the bone, whereas with an open or compound fraction, it kind of creates a diagonal jagged edge which actually pokes up and out through the skin. Now, despite the type of damages that we can create with this, no matter what, our bones will heal even if we have severe damage, but it can take up to a year. So here are the steps in terms of how bone fracture repair happens. The first step is we get a fracture hematoma, which is just simply a large blood clot that forms because we've got blood vessels. When we break bone, we're going to break blood vessels, so we need to close them off. Then mitosis, cell division, occurs in the periosteum and in the endosteum, and the new cells move into the fracture area and form a thickened area called the callus. Now the callus is made now of kind of like cartilaginous bone, and it undergoes ossification to produce a brace of spongy bone. Now remember, spongy bone can actually take stress from many different directions, so this is actually very strong. And this is usually when the doctor will take the cast off of the bone, is once this is in place. Then, even after the cast is off, though, you have remodeling is occurring, where spongy bone gets replaced with compact bone, and the bump that was once the callus actually kind of goes away and can be very, very hard to see. Now, sometimes, though, fractures are caused because we have other problems. One of them is called osteopenia. This is the process of bones becoming thicker and weaker due to our age. And this is something that actually happens in all of us, to varying degrees. It begins between the ages of 30 and 40 as our bone mass starts to reduce. And typically, women lose more bone mass than men. I want to say that it's about 10%, 8 to 10% per decade for women, and it's much less in men. So it does affect males and females differently, and it affects different bones differently. Obviously, larger bones like the tibia and femur have more to lose than, say, like our auditory ossicles in our ear. Now, if osteopenia is very severe, it can become osteoporosis. And this is when our bone mass reduction is so large it compromises the normal functioning of our bones. And this is tied to our sex level, our sex hormone production, which is why you see this occur more in women than in men, because women go through menopause, which cuts off the production of our sex hormones. Men, the testosterone level decreases, but it's a much more slow and gradual process. Okay, so it affects females the most, since our hormone production changes. And what happens with osteoporosis is our bones break very easily and do not repair very well. Treatments include hormone replacement therapy, which has actually been kind of discontinued because of side effects due to that. We also increase our dietary calcium, and we participate in bone-stressing exercises like lifting weights or anything that's going to stress them, running, using your body weight to do different exercises like wall sits and that sort of thing, puts the bones under stress. In our next section, what we will do is we will actually take a look at the different joints.